Commander Eli Moss watched the targeting reticle lock onto his cockpit and felt the strangest urge to laugh. A planet-killer beam, designed to crack continental shelves and boil oceans, was aimed at his tiny scout ship, a craft barely larger than a cargo van. The Vrellian Armada had sent 3,000 warships to deliver a message: humanity's expansion stopped here. But as the charge indicator on his HUD climbed toward lethal, Eli's fingers moved not to the eject lever, but to the experimental shield array his engineer had begged him not to activate. Because if this worked, the Vrellians were about to learn that humans didn't just survive impossible odds, they turned them into punchlines. Eli Moss had been flying solo patrols for 8 months, charting hyperspace corridors near the edge of human-controlled space, when the sensor suite lit up like a Christmas tree. At first, he thought it was a malfunction. 3,000 contacts couldn't materialize that fast. But the thermal signatures were unmistakable: Vrellian dreadnoughts, cruisers, and missile frigates, all arranged in a wedge formation that screamed military doctrine. He keyed his comms. "Beacon Station Ares, this is Scout 47. I've got a situation." Static crackled, then a voice, clipped and urgent. 47, confirm your position. Grid Epsilon 9, 30 clicks from the drift zone. I'm looking at an armada. Vrellian, they just dropped out of hyperspace in formation. Eli's hands moved across the control panel, routing power to the engines. His scout ship, the Sparrow, wasn't built for combat. It had sensor pods, sample collectors, and a single defensive turret that could barely scratch paint. 47, withdraw immediately. We're scrambling a response fleet, but ETA is 40 minutes. 40 minutes? Eli glanced at the tactical display. The Vrellian formation was already rotating, bringing their forward batteries to bear. He could see the flagship in the center, a behemoth twice the size of Earth's largest carrier, bristling with energy projectors. "Ares, I don't think I've got 40 minutes. The lead dreadnought's prow began to glow, not the dull red of standard plasma cannons, but a searing white-blue that made Eli's radiation alarms shriek. He'd seen footage of planet killers before, beams that punched through atmosphere and crust, unleashing apocalyptic energy. The Vrellians had used them to sterilize colony worlds during their expansion wars, and now one was pointed at him. Eli's engineering officer, Myra Chen, had installed the experimental shield array 3 weeks ago during a supply stop. She'd called it a kinetic reflection matrix, a system that could theoretically absorb incoming energy and redirect it along a predetermined vector. The problem was that it had never been tested outside of lab simulations. Myra had made him promise not to activate it unless he was already dead. "Well," Eli muttered, flipping the safety cover off the shield control, "close enough." The charge indicator climbed. Eli's HUD projected the beam's path, a straight line from the flagship's primary weapon to his cockpit. He had maybe 10 seconds before firing. His finger hovered over the shield activation stud. The Vrellian flagship fired. Eli slammed the stud. The Sparrow shuddered as the kinetic reflection matrix engaged. Panels along the hull unfurled, forming a geodesic lattice that shimmered with electromagnetic resonance. The planet-killer beam struck the shield dead center, and for a heartbeat, Eli thought the system would fail, thought he'd be vaporized in a flash of light. Instead, the beam bent. Eli watched, mouth open, as the energy coiled around the shield matrix like water circling a drain. The lattice glowed white-hot, then began to pulse, redirecting the beam's vector. Myra's equations had worked mostly. The shield was holding, but the redirection wasn't stable. The beam wobbled, its endpoint shifting across the tactical display. Eli grabbed the control yoke and fired maneuvering thrusters. If he could angle the shield just right, he could. The beam snapped into alignment. It shot back toward the Vrellian flagship, a lance of stolen fire that moved faster than any evasive maneuver. The flagship's shields flared, trying to absorb the impact, but a planet killer wasn't designed to be deflected. It was designed to destroy. The beam punched through the shields, cored the flagship's reactor, and detonated it from the inside out. The explosion was silent in the vacuum, but Eli felt it through the hull, a pressure wave that rattled his teeth. The flagship became a miniature sun, a sphere of plasma expanding outward. Debris sleeted across the formation, tearing into nearby cruisers. Secondary explosions followed, chain-reacting through the Armada's dense formation. Eli's tactical display flickered, updating the contact count. 3,000 ships, now 2,800, now 2,600. Ares, Eli said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The Vrellians just lost their flagship and about 400 other ships. The comms officer's voice was stunned. 4-7, how? I'll explain later. Right now, they look mad. The remaining Vrellian ships broke formation, scattering like startled fish, but they didn't retreat. Instead, they began closing in, surrounding the Sparrow in a tightening sphere. Eli's sensor suite registered targeting locks, dozens, then hundreds. They weren't going to risk another planet-killer shot. They were going to overwhelm him with sheer volume of fire. Eli rerouted power to the engines, plotting a course through the thinnest section of the sphere. But before he could engage the thrusters, his comms crackled again. This time the voice wasn't human. Human vessel, you have committed an act of war, surrender or be annihilated. Eli keyed his mic. I'm not the one who fired a planet killer at a scout ship. A pause, then, you will be destroyed. Yeah, Eli said, checking his shield array's charge status. I've heard that before. But this time, the odds were worse. The kinetic reflection matrix needed 3 minutes to recharge, and he had maybe 30 seconds before the Vrellian swarm opened fire. Eli's fingers moved across the control panel, searching for options. Then he saw it, a faint gravity signature on the edge of his sensors. A debris field left over from an ancient battle, full of shattered hulls and unstable reactor cores. If he could lure the Vrellians into it, the resulting chaos might buy him time. Eli punched the thrusters and dove toward the debris field, the Sparrow screaming through the void as 1,000 Vrellian ships gave chase. The debris field was a graveyard. Hulls from a war fought centuries ago, before humanity even left Earth, drifted in silent clusters, their alloys corroded and reactors cold. Eli threaded the Sparrow between two massive fragments, each the size of a skyscraper, their surfaces pocked with shrapnel scars. Behind him, the Vrellian pursuit poured into the field like a swarm of hornets, their formation tightening as they tried to pin him down. Eli's hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting thrust vectors and rolling the Sparrow to slip past a spinning chunk of hull plating. His HUD painted the debris in red, marking collision hazards, but he ignored most of them. The Vrellians, unfamiliar with human piloting instincts, followed his path too closely. The first cruiser clipped a reactor fragment. The impact sheared off its forward section, sending both pieces tumbling into the swarm behind it. Explosions rippled as ships collided, their pilots too focused on Eli to notice the obstacles. Ares, you still tracking me? Eli asked, banking hard to avoid a cluster of derelict satellites. Affirmative, 4-7. You've reduced the enemy count by another 200. What's your plan? Still working on that part. Eli's shield array was at 40% charge, not enough to deflect another planet killer, but maybe enough to absorb a volley of plasma fire. He glanced at the tactical display, 1,600 Vrellian ships remaining, all converging on his position. Then he spotted something on the edge of the debris field, a derelict station, its reactor core still faintly active. The readings were erratic, suggesting a containment breach, but if he could destabilize it further. Eli aimed the Sparrow straight at the station. His targeting reticle locked onto the reactor housing, a sphere encased in cracked shielding. One good shot from his defensive turret might rupture the core, triggering a cascade failure. He fired. The turret spat a burst of kinetic rounds, each one impacting the reactor housing with surgical precision. Cracks spiderwebbed across the shielding. Then, with a flash of light, the core ruptured. Eli punched the thrusters and veered away as the station exploded. The blast wave caught the nearest Vrellian ships, flipping them end over end. Plasma vented from ruptured hulls, adding to the chaos. Eli watched his tactical display update, 1,400 ships, 1,300, but the Vrellians were learning. They stopped chasing him directly and began deploying drones, small, fast, and expendable. The drones didn't need to destroy the Sparrow, they just needed to corral him, force him into a kill zone. Eli saw the trap forming. A cluster of drones ahead, another behind, funneling him toward a section of the debris field where 3 Vrellian dreadnoughts waited, their weapons charged. He needed a new trick. Eli's eyes flicked to the shield array's status, 70% charged, not enough for a full deflection, but maybe enough for something smaller. He pulled up Myra's notes on the kinetic reflection matrix, scanning the technical specs. Buried in the equations was a secondary function, a focused burst mode that could redirect a small amount of energy with pinpoint accuracy. Eli grinned. Myra, if this works, I'm buying you a drink. He activated the burst mode and waited. The drones closed in, their targeting lasers painting the Sparrow's hull. Eli let them get closer, then he fired his defensive turret at one of the drones. The kinetic round struck the drone's power cell, rupturing it. The explosion was small, barely enough to scratch the Sparrow's paint, but Eli used the shield's burst mode to redirect the blast. The energy lanced outward, striking the nearest drone in a chain reaction. That drone exploded, triggering another and another. Within seconds, the entire drone swarm was gone, consumed by cascading detonations. Eli banked hard, escaping the kill zone as the three waiting dreadnoughts opened fire on empty space. Their plasma volleys struck each other instead, shredding shields and hulls. 4-7, the Ares comms officer said, her voice almost giddy. You just took out another 100 contacts. The fleet's still 20 minutes out. Can you hold? Eli checked his fuel reserves. The Sparrow was running on fumes, and the shield array was draining power faster than the reactor could supply. He had maybe 5 minutes before he was dead in the water. I'll hold, Eli said, but they're getting smarter. The Vrellian ships regrouped, forming a loose perimeter around the debris field. They weren't chasing anymore, they were containing. And in the center of the formation, Eli saw a new contact appear, a heavy cruiser, larger than the others with a distinctive energy signature. A second planet killer. Eli's stomach sank. The shield array was at 85% charge, almost enough for another deflection. But if the Vrellians had learned from the first shot, they might compensate for his redirection. He needed to move, disrupt their firing solution. The cruiser's prow began to glow. Eli slammed the thrusters, accelerating toward the nearest cluster of debris. If he could put enough mass between himself and the cruiser, the beam might lose coherence. But the Vrellians anticipated his move. A frigate detached from the perimeter, positioning itself to block his escape. Eli gritted his teeth and activated the shield array early. The lattice unfurled, humming with stored energy. The planet killer fired. This time, Eli didn't just deflect the beam, he aimed it. The energy coiled around the shield matrix, and Eli adjusted the Sparrow's orientation, tilting the lattice to redirect the beam at a precise angle. The beam shot outward, slicing through the blocking frigate and continuing into the perimeter formation beyond. It struck a cluster of cruisers, punching through their shields and triggering a cascade of reactor detonations. The explosions spread like wildfire, consuming ship after ship. Eli watched the tactical display update. 1,200 ships, 1,800. The Vrellian formation collapsed. Ships broke away, retreating into hyperspace in ones and twos. Within minutes, the Armada was gone, leaving only debris and the faint hum of Eli's strained reactor. 4-7, the Ares comms officer said, her voice filled with disbelief. The Vrellians are withdrawing. You did it. Eli exhaled, his hands shaking on the control yoke. Yeah, I guess I did. But as he looked at the wreckage drifting around him, hulls torn apart, reactors still glowing, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The Vrellians had learned humans could fight back. Now they'd come prepared. Eli's reactor was coughing. The Sparrow had taken a beating, micro-debris had pitted the hull, coolant lines were leaking, and the shield array's lattice was warped from overuse. He nursed the throttle, coaxing the ship toward the coordinates Ares had transmitted, a rally point where the human response fleet was forming up. The debris field stretched behind him like a scar across the void. Eli had turned off the tactical display. He didn't need to see the wreckage count anymore. 800 Vrellian ships had retreated, but over 2,000 had been destroyed. The numbers didn't feel real. 4-7, this is Captain Harlan aboard the Resolute. We're inbound on your position. ETA 12 minutes. Hold tight. Eli keyed his mic. Copy, Resolute, I'll be the guy limping toward you. Harlan's voice carried a note of amusement. We saw your telemetry. That was some flying. That was some improvising, Eli corrected. And a lot of luck. Well, Command's going to want to debrief. They're calling you a hero. Eli grimaced. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a guy who'd stumbled into a fight and barely crawled out. The Sparrow's cabin smelled like burnt electronics and stressed sweat, and his hands still trembled from adrenaline. But as he approached the rally point, Eli saw the human fleet assembling, a mix of frigates, destroyers, and carrier groups, all bristling with weapons. They weren't running. They were preparing to push back. The Resolute, a heavy cruiser with Earth Command insignia, broke formation to intercept him. Its hangar bay opened, and a tractor beam locked onto the Sparrow, guiding it inside. Eli powered down his systems and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, letting the silence settle. When he finally climbed out, he was met by Captain Harlan, a tall woman with steel-gray hair and a no-nonsense expression. She looked at the Sparrow, then at Eli, and shook her head. "That ship should be scrap," she said. "Yeah, well," Eli said, patting the Sparrow's hull, "she's stubborn." Harlan gestured toward the hangar's exit. "Come on, Admiral Kovic wants to hear your story." Eli followed her through the Resolute's corridors, passing crew members who stopped and stared. Some nodded, others saluted. Eli felt his face flush. He wasn't used to attention. Scout pilots were supposed to be ghosts, charting routes and avoiding trouble. Admiral Kovic's office was Spartan, a desk, a holoscreen, and a viewport overlooking the fleet. Kovic himself was a bulldog of a man, compact and blunt, with a scar running from his temple to his jaw. "Moss," Kovic said, not looking up from his datapad. "Sit." Eli sat. Kovic swiped through something on the pad, then set it down. "You just handed the Vrellians their worst defeat in a century. How?" Eli explained the shield array, the deflection, the improvised tactics. Kovic listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Eli finished, Kovic leaned back. "Your engineer, Chen, right? She's being reassigned to Fleet R&D. We're going to mass-produce that shield system." Eli blinked. "Just like that, just like that." Kovic tapped his datapad. "You gave us a blueprint, Moss, now we're going to use it." Eli felt a flicker of unease. "Admiral, the system's unstable. I got lucky. If the beam had been stronger or the angle off by a degree, then you'd be dead and we'd be having a very different conversation." Kovic's tone was flat. "But you're not dead, you're here, and the Vrellians are retreating. That's what matters." Eli wanted to argue, but he didn't have the energy. Instead, he asked, "What's next?" Kovic stood and walked to the viewport. Outside, the fleet was moving into formation, a wall of steel and plasma. "The Vrellians came here to send a message. We're going to send one back." 3 days later, Eli found himself back in the cockpit of a scout ship, not the Sparrow, which was still in repair, but a newer model with upgraded sensors and a prototype shield array. Myra Chen had installed it herself, muttering about stress tolerances and reactor feeds, but she'd given him a thumbs up before sealing the hatch. "Don't break this one," she'd said. Eli had grinned, no promises. Now he was part of a strike force, 12 scout ships, 6 destroyers, and the Resolute as the flagship. Their target was a Vrellian staging area in the Kesek system, a supply hub where the retreating armada was regrouping. Admiral Kovic's strategy was simple: hit them before they could recover. Show them that humanity wasn't just defending, it was hunting. Eli's role was reconnaissance. He and the other scouts would slip into the system ahead of the main fleet, map enemy positions, and identify weak points. Standard procedure, except for the part where the Vrellians now knew humans could redirect planet killers. The jump into hyperspace was smooth. Eli watched the stars stretch into lines, then vanish as the Sparrow II entered the slipstream. Around him, the other scouts maintained formation, their hulls dark and silent. When they dropped out near Kesek, Eli's sensors lit up. The system was crowded, dozens of Vrellian ships orbiting a gas giant, their hulls clustered around mobile supply depots. But something was off. The formation was too loose, too scattered. "Resolute, this is Scout Lead," Eli transmitted. "I'm seeing a lot of activity, but no defensive perimeter." "It's like they're not expecting us." Harlan's voice came through. "Confirmed, Scout Lead, maintain position and gather data." Eli adjusted his sensor sweep, focusing on the supply depots. They were massive orbital platforms bristling with fuel pods and munitions. If the fleet could destroy those, the Vrellians would be crippled. But as Eli scanned deeper, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A ship, hidden behind the gas giant's shadow, with an energy signature identical to the planet killer cruiser he'd faced before. "Resolute, I've got a problem. There's a planet killer in the system. Looks like they're setting a trap." Kovic's voice cut in, sharp. "Scout Lead, fall back. We're aborting the strike." "Negative," Eli said, his mind racing. "If we pull out now, they'll know we spotted them. We need to neutralize that cruiser." "Moss, you're outnumbered 100 to 1. "Yeah," Eli said, angling the Sparrow II toward the gas giant. "But I've got an idea." He didn't wait for approval. He dove toward the planet killer, his shields charging. The other scouts followed, their formation tight. The Vrellian cruiser detected them and began charging its weapon. Eli could see the prow glowing, the same searing white-blue as before, but this time he wasn't deflecting, he was baiting. Eli flew straight at the cruiser, drawing its fire. The planet killer beam lanced out, and Eli activated his shield array, redirecting the beam not back at the cruiser but at the nearest supply depot. The depot exploded in a chain reaction, its fuel pods igniting in a cascade of fire. The blast consumed the surrounding ships, and Eli veered away, his hull rattling from the pressure wave. The other scouts opened fire, targeting the remaining depots. Explosions rippled across the system, and the Vrellian formation collapsed into chaos. The Resolute and the destroyers jumped in, their weapons blazing. Within minutes, the staging area was gone, and the Vrellians were fleeing once again. Eli pulled the Sparrow II back toward the fleet, his hands steady on the controls. Behind him, the gas giant glowed with reflected firelight, a beacon of humanity's first offensive victory. Back aboard the Resolute, Eli stood in the observation deck, watching the fleet regroup. The battle at Kesek had cost them 2 destroyers and 5 scouts, but the Vrellians had lost an entire staging hub. Command was calling it a turning point. Eli didn't know if that was true. He just knew he was tired. Myra Chen found him there, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one and leaned against the viewport. "You're going to be famous," she said. "I don't want to be famous." "Too bad, Command's already talking about medals." Eli sipped the coffee. It was terrible, but it was warm. "I just want to go back to charting hyperspace lanes." Myra smiled. "You will, eventually, but right now you're the guy who caught a planet killer and threw it back. That's not something people forget." Eli looked at her. "You built the system, you should get the credit. I built it, you used it. Big difference." They stood in silence for a while, watching the stars. Then Myra said, "You know what the Vrellians are going to do now, right?" Eli nodded. "They'll come back with more ships, better tactics." "Yeah," Myra's voice was quiet, "but so will we." Eli thought about the Sparrow, the jury-rigged shield array, the moments when he'd been certain he was about to die. He thought about the 800 Vrellian ships that had retreated and the 2,000 that hadn't. "We didn't start this fight," Eli said, "but we're going to finish it." Myra raised her mug. "To finishing it." Eli clinked his mug against hers. "To finishing it." Outside, the fleet began moving, heading deeper into contested space. Eli watched them go, knowing that the war was just beginning, but also knowing that humanity had sent a message the Vrellians wouldn't forget. They'd fired a planet killer at a scout ship, and the human had caught it and sent it back. Now the galaxy knew humanity didn't just survive, it returned fire, creatively. 6 months later, Eli Moss stood on the observation deck of a newly commissioned station, watching a convoy of supply ships pass by. The station was named after the Sparrow, the original scout ship that had started it all. Myra Chen's kinetic reflection matrix was now standard on every human vessel, and training simulations based on Eli's tactics were mandatory for all pilots. Eli had returned to charting hyperspace lanes, but he carried a commendation from Earth Command and a reputation that followed him everywhere. People still asked him about the battle at Epsilon 9, about the moment he'd redirected the planet killer. He always gave them the same answer: "I just did what had to be done." But late at night, when the stars were bright and the void was silent, Eli thought about the Vrellian ships still out there, waiting, regrouping, planning their next move. And he knew that when they came, humanity would be ready, because humans didn't just catch fire, they sent it back brighter, hotter, and twice as fierce.